Hello everyone, welcome to StudyIQ. So we will continue our discussion on economy. We are in the module budget. So we started off with budget. First session is over. So basically we talked about what is budget, the constitutional provisions and the structure of budget in the previous session. So in this session we'll be dealing with various budgetary deficits. So I'll talk about budget deficit. What is budget deficit as a concept? Then we'll discuss fiscal deficit. We will talk about revenue deficit, effective revenue deficit, primary deficit. All these concepts will be discussed. The impact of fiscal deficit we'll discuss. Then we'll talk about fiscal reforms, Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act 2003. All those things will be covered systematically. So this is what we have done in the previous session, right? We started off with budget. Budget is actually annual financial statement of estimated receipts and expenditure of the government for the forthcoming financial year. So it is nothing but government policy and strategy to achieve socio-economic objectives. Okay, so budget will state the government policy and strategy to achieve its various socio-economic objectives like removal of poverty, infrastructure development, and all those things will be covered. It is nothing but annual plan or annual fiscal policy of the government. We have said that the constitutional provision related to budget is actually Article 112. Under Article 112, it is actually the duty of the President to ensure the presentation of annual financial statement of the government in both the houses of Parliament, Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha, before the financial year. And state government also have to come with the budget, okay, annual financial statement under Article 202. So it is compulsory for state government under Article 202, and for central government it is Article 112. Then we have seen the structure of budget. So mainly budget divided into two, receipts and expenditure. Receipts further divided into revenue receipts and capital receipts. Expenditure, revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. So if you see there is a change in asset or liability, that will be capital expenditure or capital receipts. So capital means there has to be something to do with assets and liability. So you can see capital expenditure means it is an expenditure, so you are spending. So when you are spending means you might be buying something, so that lead to asset creation, so that lead to increase in assets. So capital expenditure always lead to increase in asset, or this expenditure may be to repay some loans or borrowings, etc., right? So that will reduce the liability. So you can see capital expenditure will have, you can understand in this way, either your asset will increase. So if it is an expenditure which increase your asset, that is capital expenditure, right? So similarly, if there is an expenditure which reduce your liability, that is again capital expenditure. So capital expenditure is actually considered as very good because it either increases assets or reducing liability. Both are considered desirable. On the other hand, if you see capital receipts, assets are decreasing because you are getting money, so you might be selling something, right? So disinvestment is an example, sale of assets is an example, etc. Similarly, liabilities, capital liabilities, capital receipts in that liabilities increase. Why? Because you might be borrowing. Because when you're receiving, you might be borrowing, and this is having a liability. You have to pay it back. So when you're borrowing, liability will increase. So that is also, when I'm talking about liability, capital, you are receiving money, so receipts. Okay, so I hope you understood. Apart from that, we have discussed about revenue receipts and revenue expenditure. These are revenue expenditure. Interest payment, this one I want to stress on. When I'm talking about loans, that is part of capital, because if you are lending, then it is capital expenditure, because the lending is actually your asset. The loan which you are giving is your asset. So asset increasing when you are lending. Similarly, when you are borrowing, that the loan that you are taking, that will be a liability. Okay, so when you are giving loan, that is an asset. When you are taking loan, that is a liability. So that will be part of either capital expenditure or capital receipts. When you are giving, it is capital expenditure. When you are receiving, it is capital receipts. But the interest that you paid upon that loan, that is not having anything to do with asset or liability. If you are paying back interest, that doesn't mean that your liability is decreasing. Similarly, if you are receiving interest, that doesn't mean that your asset is increasing, right? So if you are paying interest, that will be expenditure. Which expenditure? Revenue expenditure, because it is having nothing to do with liability. It won't reduce the liability. Similarly, if you are receiving interest, that will be part of receipt. Which receipt? Revenue receipt, because assets is not increasing or liability is not decreasing. Nothing to do with liability here. Okay, so interest payment, apart from that, subsidies, these are direct. You can see and you can understand. Expenditure on civil administration, all these things we have done. Then we have discussed about revenue receipts. Okay, revenue expenditure done, revenue receipts, tax revenue, 85% of the revenue receipts, and non-tax revenue we have discussed in detail. Personal income tax, corporate income tax, excise, service tax, customs. Then all these will be around 99% of the tax revenue. Then other taxes like corporate gain tax, securities transaction tax, and all those things we have covered. Then non-tax revenue, profit from PSUs, that is the largest source. Then profit from economic services, departmental undertakings. Then profit from social services. Interest receipts, that is the second largest source. Fees, fines, gifts, S-sheets, etc. Okay, so this is what we have discussed in the previous session, the structure of budget and what do you mean by budget. So today we will start with budgetary deficits. Okay, so budgetary deficits means budget deficit firstly, and it is not a concept anymore now, it is not using. Okay, but I'll anyway just talk about what is budget deficit. Fiscal deficit is more important. After that we'll talk about fiscal deficit, then we'll see primary deficit, effective revenue deficit, and all those things. Okay, and we will make a comparison also. So let's start with the budget deficit. Budget deficit. So what is budget deficit? It is nothing but it is actually the excess of total expenditure over total revenue of the government except internal borrowings. Okay, so let me write down here. It is the excess of total expenditure over total receipts of the. Now you understood what I mean by total expenditure, right? Revenue expenditure, capital expenditure, total receipts, revenue receipts, capital receipts of the government except internal borrowings. I'll tell you what is this internal borrowings, then you'll understand. Except internal borrowings during a financial year. You can complete that definition. So it is nothing but the excess of total expenditure over total receipts of the government except the internal borrowings during a financial year. So basically you can represent budget deficit equal to total expenditure minus total revenue, which is equal to 0 because it is not including the internal borrowing. So whatever mismatches there, internal borrowings will be there. See, there was a concept of ad hoc treasury bills. Earlier there was a concept of ad hoc treasury bills. So ad hoc treasury bills, it is actually used for internal borrowings by the government. Okay, so it was like 91 days. Now it is abolished. So it is actually a short-term bonds. Ad hoc treasury bills is nothing but short-term government bonds, and it is actually used for this internal borrowings by the government. So let me write down what is ad hoc treasury bills. These are special type of treasury bills. Okay, these are special type of treasury bills with a short term, that is 91 days. Okay, 91 days. So it is short term government bonds or 91 days government bonds issued by government to the central bank for temporary borrowing to cover the gap, basically time lag. Okay, the gap between its receipts and expenditures. See, that's why I've written this as 0 when you are including this. Okay, so it will be 0. Now total expenditure minus total revenue, that is except internal borrowings, that has to be 0. So here I'll tell you what is the reason, what is the need for doing this. For example, if you take the first quarter. Okay, so first quarter it starts from April. So April, then May and June. So you will have receipts here, and you will have expenditure here. So for example, government is planning for let's say 100 crore expenditure and government is expecting 100 crore revenue. That means effectively no deficit here. You can see 100 crore expenditure, 100 crore revenue. But in April, government was able to realize 10 crore receipts. But there was an expenditure of, let's say, 50 crore. Okay. So how much extra is there? Extra 40 crore is there. Now, from where government get money? Government get this 40 crore by issuing this ad hoc treasury bill to the central government. Similarly, if you see in May, let's say 20 crore is the receipts and there is an expenditure of, let's say, 30 crore. So how much extra government requires apart from revenue? 10 crore. So this is how you get it. You issue the ad hoc bonds, okay? So ad hoc treasury bills and you'll get the money. Now next year, how much you get receipts? 70 and your expenditure is 20. So that you can see here it is 100, this also 100. So here now government is getting 20 expenditure but 70 is getting, that means 50 extras there with government. So 50 borrowed, now 50 extra you have, you can compensate that. Okay, so that is the objective. So this is very much considered desirable because this is short term. Your short term borrowing to match the revenue and expenditure. It is not necessary that you will get immediately all the receipts which you have planned. Okay, similarly you might be spending more in the initial quarter. So to match with this revenue and expenditure, that time gap, especially government was using this special type of treasury bills or ad hoc treasury bills, which is of short term. Why short term? Why 91 days? Because you can see here this is for 3 months. Okay, so ad hoc treasury bill because it is for a particular quarter and it is very much desirable. So I hope you understood this. But what happened is government started using this ad hoc treasury bills for permanent borrowings. Okay, so government started using this ad hoc treasury bills for permanent borrowing, and that lead to what? That leading to unintentional monetization of deficit. Okay, so like that led to printing of currency. Monetization of deficit means monetized deficit. I'll tell you what is monetized deficit. That is nothing but deficit financing. That led to deficit financing. So when I'm talking about deficit financing, we have already discussed about this many times. It is nothing but printing of currency. Okay, so printing of currency. So because of this issue, since government started using this for permanent borrowing, and that led to unintentional deficit financing, it was actually stopped in, this concept was actually stopped in 1997. So now there is no such concept of budget deficit once it is done. Okay, so there is no point in talking about budget deficit, but as a concept, I've just discussed it. Now we mostly use fiscal deficit, revenue deficit, and effective revenue deficit, primary deficit, and all those concepts. This monetized deficit or budgetary deficit, there is no budget deficit, we don't want to discuss. Okay, but since we are starting with budgetary deficit, I started with the most important concept, that is budget deficit. Now it doesn't exist. Okay, now in 1997 onwards, the ways and means advances instead of treasury bills. Ways and means advances means short term borrowing from RBI. Okay, so ways and means advances, WMA. So under WMA, under ways and means advances, under WMA, RBI provides short-term loans to the central and state governments to enable them to overcome the temporary mismatch between their receipts and expenditure. So it is actually a type of overdraft facility. So it is a kind of overdraft facility. See, it is a very important fiscal reform because it won't lead to printing of currency. Earlier it was leading to printing of currency. Now no printing of money now, so no deficit. Okay, so ways and means advances. Under this, RBI provides short-term loans to the central and state governments to enable them to overcome the temporary mismatch between their receipts and expenditure. So I hope this is clear. Now here, if you talk about deficit financing, printing of currency, deficit financing, that lead to a lot of problem in the economy. Most important problem is actually inflation, which is considered undesirable. Now how deficit financing lead to inflation, or simply how printing of currency leading to inflation? In the previous module, we have talked about inflation. So you know what lead to inflation? Money supply lead to inflation, because money supply, if money supply increasing, what will happen? Aggregate demand will increase. Why aggregate demand is increasing? When money supply is increasing, more money, so actually purchasing power will increase, and that lead to increase in demand. So when increase in demand is there, you can see here, let's suppose this is the aggregate demand, this is the aggregate supply, this is national income, and this is price level. So this is the current situation. Now let's say money supply is increased, so demand will increase, so demand curve shift rightward, right? So you can see here new equilibrium is formed like this. So you can see here prices are increasing. So this is how inflation is happening. Now imagine this situation. Let's say in the entire economy, let's say 100 rupees there. Okay, 100 rupees there in total, only 100 rupees there, or 1000 rupees there in the economy. Let's say 10 or 100 goods are there. Okay, only 100 goods are there. Just for explanation purpose, hypothetical, just take it in this way. Okay, so only 1000 rupees are there available and 100 goods are there. So this 1000 rupees now chasing this 100 goods. So what do you think will be the price of 1 rupee? Price of one good, the price of one good will be 10 rupee. Okay, so let's say out of this 100, let's say 700 is with 700 is with private. Okay, private, and 300 is with government. Okay, so 300 rupees with the government and 700 is with the private. So how many goods private can buy? You know, 100 goods, out of which 70 can be bought by the private by spending 700, because one good cost 10, and 300 could be bought by, you know, government, right? 300 rupees there, so 30 could be bought by government. Now imagine a situation where government is printing some excess currency. Let's say 400 rupee extra is printed. Now how much currency is there in the market? Let's say 1400, but goods remain the same. Only currency is printed. That doesn't mean that value addition, see, that is the most important problem. Value addition is not happening, the production is not happening, only currency is printed. Because of that, you know, this 1400 is now chasing 100 goods. So what do you think will be the price of one good? 14 rupee. So 10 to 14, this is what you can say inflation. The price is actually increased, so that lead to inflation. Now more than that, this inflation will also act as a kind of, you know, in this printing of currency will act as an inflation tax. How is it actually going to happen? Now see how much private can buy. This extra 400 rupee will be with whom? This extra 400 rupee will be with the government. So now out of this 1400, 700 is for private and 700 is for government, because earlier 300, now 400. Now private can buy how much? 50 only, because if it was 10 with the 700 you could have bought 70. Now it is 14, but rupee with you is the same, right? So you can buy only 50, and how much government can buy? 50. So what happened here? Private from 70 to 50, government from 30 to 50. So government is actually increased, private is actually decreased, but effectively there is no production. So what happening during deficit financing? There is no production, printing of money is there, money supply is there, that lead to inflation, and it will only transfer resources from private to government. So it's a kind of inflation tax. Okay, so if it lead to only transfer of resources, it is not going to create any resources, it is not going to create any production. This remain the same. You are simply printing the currency, so it transfer resources from private to government, because government is having more money now. I hope you understood. So that is a problem with deficit financing. Okay, so that should not be there. So, and that is not there now after FRBM 2003. We will discuss that also shortly. Now we'll discuss about fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit. Okay, see, fiscal deficit in simple terms, I can tell you, it is nothing but borrowings of government. So I don't want to talk in terms of expenditure, revenue, etc. Simply borrowings. So how much you are borrowing, that is your fiscal deficit. Simple understanding. You see the borrowings, that is what fiscal deficit. I'll show you how. Or first let me write down the definition and I'll explain the definition and I'll show you how borrowing is your fiscal deficit. Okay. So it is the excess of total expenditure. It is the excess of total expenditure of the government over its total receipts other than borrowings during a financial year, that you complete during a financial year. So it is nothing but fiscal deficit equal to total expenditure minus total receipts except borrowings. Okay, so fiscal deficit is what you can understand from here. It is nothing but borrowings. Okay, so fiscal deficit is nothing but borrowing. Now here, let me show you here. Fiscal deficit is total expenditure. Now this total receipts except borrowing, what will be that? Let me show you here. Revenue receipts. So total receipts, revenue receipts, okay, that is not part of borrowings, plus which part of capital expenditure, capital receipts is not coming under borrowing? Non-debt creating capital receipts. Okay, that means assets. So you can see here, we have discussed it here already. So revenue receipts, I'm totally talking about this one. This one is there. If you talk about total receipts, revenue receipts is there. In capital receipts, this one is not borrowing, but this is borrowing. Okay, so this we don't include. So I hope that is clear, that we don't include. Okay, let's see budget. I'll show you here. Budget, you have revenue side and you have expenditure side, and revenue you have or receipts here, expenditure here. So revenue receipts and capital receipts here, capital expenditure and revenue expenditure. Okay, so this is what we have already done. Now expenditure, this means what? This expenditure means this total expenditure. So this will be covered. So that portion is over, total expenditure. Now in the total receipts, revenue receipts, that means this portion is over. And here capital receipts, if you see, there are assets and liability, right? Capital receipts, assets and liability is there. So non-debt creating capital asset, what is that? That is nothing but this assets. So this portion is nothing but this one. So this has been taken care, this has been taken care, this has been done. So total expenditure means this total is gone. Okay, revenue receipts means this is gone. From capital receipts, what is non-debt recovering, non-debt creating? That is assets. So what is your fiscal deficit? Your fiscal deficit is nothing but this liability. This is your fiscal deficit, and that is nothing but borrowing. Okay, so here you can simply write this is nothing but borrowings, or from this you can see it is nothing but liability, because your liability is your borrowing. I hope that has to be clear for you. From here you see here liability is only borrowing. It can be internal and it can be external, doesn't matter. So liability, borrowing, that is what your fiscal deficit. I hope this is clear. There is no need to have any confusion. This is so technical. Once you understood, you'll never forget it, and this is the best way to understand. Reading textbook, it's not required after this. So reading textbook also, you may not be able to understand it like this. Okay, so it is nothing but borrowing. So when I'm talking about fiscal deficit, it is borrowing, okay, or liability. So fiscal deficit effectively measures the government liability from also all sources. All sources include internal as well as external. So it is the most comprehensive concept of budgetary deficit. Very important concept. So its impact on economy actually depends on, the borrowed funds, how much you're borrowing. So impact on economy will be depending on that. More borrowing means, more money supply, so that lead to inflation and all those things. That is different. So you can understand the impact of economy on fiscal deficit from the size of borrowing. Okay, so or how you use the borrowed funds. If you are using it for social welfare, etc., the money is coming in the economy. So that will create increase in money supply, that will increase the purchasing power, that will increase the inflation. For example, there was a World Bank study. MGNREGA is actually reason for increasing inflation in India because it is increasing purchasing power. So increase in food inflation in India is because of MGNREGA. Okay, it was in fact actually good because it helps in solving the problem of hunger, which was a Millennium Development Goal, and it was also part of Sustainable Development Goal. By 2030, we have to eliminate hunger. Okay, and we'll do that easily because of this. Okay, before I discuss about Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, I'll just take one point from that. See, with respect to fiscal deficit, there is a provision, as per FRBM, this fiscal deficit has to be reduced by 3% of GDP by 2008. Okay, 3% of GDP by 2008. So as per FRBM 2003, we will discuss this in detail, so don't worry about this. This in itself is one session, so I'll be discussing after the next session. This session deficits, I think I take one more session because 30 minutes only available. So next 30 minutes I'll be talking about other deficits like effective revenue deficit, primary deficit, monetized deficits and everything. Then we will move for fiscal reforms. There I'll entirely I'll cover completely this FRBM. Okay, so as per FRBM, 3% of GDP by 2008. Now, how you see this? See, it's like this. Let's say 2015-16 if you take. Okay, so if this is the last year, let's suppose this is the last year. I'm taking much back because this is for explanation purpose. Okay, and we'll come to this current year also. So 2015-16. Let's suppose this is last year. So here actual data you will take, actual data of last year. So you will get the fiscal deficit. Okay, I don't remember exactly. Then let's suppose current year. Let's suppose current year, if this is last year, current year will be 2016-17. So 2016-17. Why I've written 2 is because here there will be a budget estimate. Okay, that is in the month of February, and here there will be a revised estimate. Okay, so this is BE, budget estimate, revised estimate. Write it properly. I'm not writing completely so that you can avoid confusion later. So this is by February and this will be a revised estimate. So let's say this is revenue deficit, fiscal deficit here was 3.5%, 3.5%. Okay, then they will go for next year. Okay, that is 2017-18. So here it will be budget estimate. Revised estimate you won't get. So here last year you get the actual data. Current year you have a budget estimate as well as revised estimate. Next year there will be a budget estimate. So let's say 3.2% like this. Okay. Similarly, after this what will happen? This current year will become previous year. So you will get actual data of 2016-17. So here you will get actual data. Then what will be the current year? 2017-18. So 2017-18, then you need to draw 2, right? So this will become 2. Here you will have a budget estimate and you have a revised estimate because budget estimate is given already here. Then you have a revised estimate. Then you will have next year, right? What is that? 2018-19. Okay. Similarly, this current year will become previous year in the next year. So how will you write that? 2017-18. So you will get the actual data. Then 2018-19 budget estimate, 18-19 revised estimate, and then next year budget estimate. So 19-20 budget estimate. So like this you will see. So I hope you will be in a position to understand if you are seeing like this. So there is no need to have any confusion. Now we will discuss about adverse impact of fiscal deficit. Adverse impacts of fiscal deficit on economy. I've told you already the impact on economic development can be understood by or seeing the use of the borrowed funds. There's nothing but borrowing. So how the government is using this, based on that you can actually understand. Now let's quickly look into adverse impact of fiscal deficit. So the first one is actually it increases the public debt. Okay, so it increases public debt. So if public debt is increasing, what will happen? The interest liabilities will increase. That will be gone from revenue side. Okay, so revenue expenditure will increase. So revenue expenditure increasing means that is not considered good. If you remember when we discussed interest payment, I've told you 1/5 of the budget is actually going as interest payments upon the borrowing. That is not considered desirable. Okay, because we have a 50% of GDP, our public debt is 50% of GDP, which is so high, and that's why 1/5 of our budget is actually going as interest payment, 20%, okay, which is so high. So increases public debt. So what will happen? Increase interest payments. So don't you think that will affect the developmental expenditure? So it will result into decrease in developmental expenditure. So decrease in developmental expenditure. So it is not considered desirable in this side, because debt is increasing, interest burden will increase, so developmental expenditure will have to be decreased. And secondly, I have told you it create inflation. So that is very important. It create inflation. Why? Because this borrowed fund, if you are using or if you are pumping in the economy, what happened? Or just before also I have told you, I have shown you the example with that graph itself. So here aggregate demand will increase. Aggregate demand will increase means why aggregate demand is increasing? Because of high money supply. Because of money supply, purchasing power will increase, so automatically demand will increase, so automatically price will increase. Because supply is in short, right? Demand is increasing, but supply is not increasing as per demand. So that lead to inflation. Then it lead to very important concept, crowding out. Crowding out. See, crowding out means it actually refers to reduction of private investment. Reduction of private investment due to high interest rate. I'll explain this, as a result of excessive government borrowing. So here what I'm saying is, if government is borrowing too much, you know what will happen? The demand for fund is increasing. Demand for fund is increasing means the cost of fund is increasing. See, something, the demand is increasing, cost of that will increase. So here demand for fund is increasing, so the cost of fund is increasing. Cost of fund means interest. And now interest is increasing because of excessive demand of fund. So that will affect the private sector. They cannot borrow, they cannot invest. Okay. If you want, I'll show you that in a graph also. Diagram you can see. See, demand for fund is increasing. So demand for fund is increasing means interest will increase. So that lead to private investment decrease. This is what you call as crowding out effect. Okay. So you can see here, let's suppose on the x-axis you go for funds, which is required, okay. Then here interest. So interest means cost of funds. So let's suppose this is the current situation. This is the current interest rate, okay. Now demand for fund is increasing. So demand curve shift rightward. So you can see here interest is actually increasing. So interest increasing means it makes private investment decrease, because they cannot borrow now. The cost of fund is more, so they reduce the investment. So that's what crowding out. Crowding in means what? Crowding in, it is not the opposite. It is crowding in means government promote private investment. Government promote private investment. How? By increase in public expenditure. Okay, so with increase in public expenditure, the investment, private investment also increase. That is what crowding in. For example, government provide infrastructure, power facility, etc. These kinds of things are example for crowding in. So just I'm saying increase in public expenditure. So increase in private investment. Earlier, increase in government borrowing result in, decrease in private investment. That was crowding out. This is crowding in. Okay. So that's about today's session. So if you have any doubt, you can get in touch with me here. This is my Instagram ID. Join this Telegram channel. You will get all my videos over there. Watch the videos. Your economy will be done completely. There is no need to read any textbooks or refer to any other materials. We are covering each and every topic for prelims as well as mains very comprehensively. You can trust me and you can just see this video. Your economy preparation will be complete. Okay. So see you guys. If you need any help, mentorship or classes, you can get in touch with me here. So see you. Thank you.